My dad's favorite passage in the Bible comes from Luke 15. It's a story I've heard quite a few times growing up. It's a story that I think in some ways my dad sees his story in. And it's a story I've read multiple times, studied multiple times, but this morning whenever I read it, it hit me a little different. Luke chapter 15, the parable of the prodigal son. I'm sure you've heard it or a version of it, but let me at least kind of review the situation. In Luke chapter 15, verse 11, Jesus begins to tell this parable of this man who has two sons, and the younger son comes to the father and he asks for the father to give him his share of the estate, to give him his inheritance. On some level, the son is coming to the father and saying, I wish you were dead. Because whenever you're dead, then I get my inheritance. And I don't want to wait any longer for you to die. I want my inheritance now. And the father, in this tender graciousness, divides his property between them, gives him his inheritance, and the youngest son leaves the presence of the father. And he goes and squanders all of his wealth in wild living. That's verse 13. And after he had spent everything, the problem was a severe famine hits the whole country in verse 14. And at one point, he is so hungry that in verse 16, he is actually eating with the pigs. This is what has become of his life. Not just spiritually, but in this sense, physically. Then comes verse 17. I'm going to start reading from there. He says, when he came to his senses, when the youngest son came to his senses, he said, man, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. It's like, I remember how my father used to take care of the people that even worked for him. They had food to spare. And I'm his son, and I'm out here starving to death. He says in verse 18, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, this is what his goal is. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you by longing for your death. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. Notice here what the goal is, though. The goal is actually not forgiveness. The goal is to be protected by the presence of his father. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son because of what I've done to you. Instead, please just make me like one of your hired servants. Just allow me to be a part of your fold. So he got up, verse 20, and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, I love this picture of the dad. His father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. In the ancient world, a father running, a grown man running, was incredibly shameful. But in this moment, the father is so overcome with his love for his child that he throws caution to the wind and storms out to meet his son, throws his arms around him, and gives him a huge kiss. Verse 21, the son said to him what he had been reciting the whole way home. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Notice again, the goal is not forgiveness. The goal is to secure the protection and the presence of his father. The presence of his father who takes care of those that are within his fold. I mean, the father here has already shown that he has forgiven him. That's what's interesting too. I don't even think it's the goal of the father to forgive his son. That already happened a long time ago. The goal of the father is to simply be with his son. Verse 22, the father, ignoring what the son says to the servants, quick, hurry, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, all of us. Let's party. For this son of mine was dead, but he's alive again. He was lost, but now is found. In verse 24, they began to celebrate. Now, if you've heard this parable before, you know how it ends. The older son comes in from the field. He's been working and he's hearing all of the music and he's seeing the dancing. In verse 26, he calls one of the servants and says, what's going on? And the servant says, your brother has come home and your father got super excited, killed the fattened calf, and threw him a party. And that sets the older son off. The oldest son, verse 28, the older brother became angry and he refused to go into the party. Are you kidding me? So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Notice this. The reward of being the father's son for the youngest son was all the stuff that he gets. And fascinatingly enough, it's the same goal, the same reward that the oldest son thinks that he deserves. The materials, the things that I get, that's my goal. But I find it interesting that when the youngest son goes through hell, on his way back, his goal is no longer all of the stuff that he squandered. His goal is the presence of the Father, to be brought into the Father's fold. And it's something that the oldest son simply overlooked as the greatest gift he could receive. But notice in verse 31 that it's also the gift the Father thought he was truly giving. My son, the Father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. But notice that opening line, my son, you are always with me. That is the gift. That is the goal. That is the reward. You know, for some of us that are far off, we think that the goal is to be forgiven by the Father. We think that that is a reward, forgiveness that we are not worthy of. But what I want to say to you today, whether you've been a Christian for 40 years and yet have a distant relationship with God, or if you're watching this and you have not been a believer for 40 years, because you're afraid also now that the damage that you have done by squandering all that God has given you is so much he would not receive you. Here's my challenge for you. Simply go be with the Father. Just bring yourself to him and realize that the greatest gift is his presence. Not all of the party, not the fattened calf. That stuff is trimming, not even forgiveness. All of that comes with his presence, but the greatest gift is himself. The greatest gift is the Father. Just simply come to him. And when your eyes begin to be opened, that the gift of following God is God, then and only then will you truly be able to find peace, forgiveness, and grace. I love you guys. Have a good week.